Okay, so my guest tonight is Dr. Amit Etkin. He's a trained psychiatrist, neuroscience, and has been on the Stanford faculty since 2010, although now he's an adjunct. He founded, I'm sorry, I have wrong biography. As a tenured professor, he became an international leader in the neuroscience of psychiatric disorders and their treatments. In recognition of the ideas of his work, he received the Director's Pioneer Award, the most competitive and prestigious NIH grant, and the first one given in clinical psychiatry. He received his MD, PhD at Columbia University with Nobel laureate Eric Kandel, and completed his psychiatric residency and concurrent postdoc at Stanford University with Alan Schatzberg. So very impressive credentials. And now you left all this to start a company. So why don't you tell us about your company?
Yeah, thank you. Good to join you tonight. So the company that I founded is called Alto Neuroscience. I'm currently CEO of the company and actually left my tenured professorship at Stanford to lead it. And what we really do is think of it as a big mission driven through two sets of activities. And the big view is creating what we call the first set of precision therapeutics or precision medicines for the brain. So drugs that work better for a particular patient with a particular condition by virtue of identifying that patient through some piece of biology that tells us how they are different from others. And so to advance that, we actually have to advance two things at the same time. One is understanding the biology of mental illness, and the other is the drugs to treat it. And that's what we do under one roof. We have a company now, about 50 people, half data science and half clinical operations, running studies, analyzing data, trying to understand how is it that people with psychiatric disorders are different. The motivation for all this is around the fact that basically for the entire history of psychiatry, whether you're talking about medication, psychotherapy, brain stimulation, doesn't really matter. All of the treatment has been trial and error. And that is, all of our medications developed with no real idea of what it is that's altered in that person that you can measure. You can say that that relates to why they would or would not respond to that treatment. And so clinicians who are, well-meaning, who are trying their best to treat the patient, nonetheless have no tools at their disposal beyond their own clinical experience and clinical acumen. And that makes it hard. That makes it hard for patients. That makes it hard for providers. That makes it hard for health systems. And as we see it, the way to bend that curve, the curve that's only getting worse and worse these days, is by developing drugs in a different way, developing them really with the patient in mind.
So you mentioned that in the past 20 years, only one drug that works in a new way has been approved for major depressive disorder, and none have been approved for PTSD or addiction. And during the last 2 years with the pandemic, they say we're in an epidemic of depression, anxiety. We will have PTSD if we don't already. And I just wanted to, before this, I talked a little bit about, some of my personal history. I took a drug for anxiety and it didn't work. I was on it for, you have to wait about 3 weeks to see if it works. Didn't work. Then if you want to switch to a new class of drugs, in my case, I tried to switch to Zoloft. I had to wait 2 weeks for the other drug to wash out, and then start on, a low dose and wait 4 weeks to see if it worked, and it didn't work. And now a blood pressure drug is not like that. A blood pressure drug, you take it for a week or so, I guess, or maybe even less, and you can tell it works right away. Xanax works in 20 minutes, if it works or not. We don't have anything like that in depression except ketamine, which is a fast acting, but has to be given intravenously. ECT, which is not the electroconvulsive therapy, which is not an ideal way to, that's really, first of all, it's really only for, patients who are suicidal, and really, really severely depressed. But it's not an ideal way, to treatment. And certainly one you can't, you can't take a pill at home. So how are you looking at the brain differently? And what are you finding?
Yeah. So, to start with, it's actually just looking at the brain that's important, even to begin with, because traditionally, the way any treatment has been developed is without any reference to the brain or to attributes about that person beyond their symptoms. So, for example, in depression, and this is true for any disorder, you use clinical criteria to understand what is the diagnosis or diagnoses of that person, some background issues like have they been relatively resistant in the past, and then you enroll them in trials. And when you do that, what happens is that you get a very small effect of the drug when you average across people, because only a portion of people respond really well to the drug and different from placebo, and the rest respond very similarly. And so by looking at the brain, the goal is to try to understand which bucket somebody belongs in. Are they responding to the drug and responding well and specifically, or are they getting the same responses they would to a placebo? And so what we do is we take the view, number one, that psychiatric disorders and certain neurological disorders are disorders of brain circuits, that is, areas of the brain that are interconnected to achieve certain functions, cognition, emotion, the ability to regulate emotion, the ability to maintain and direct drive, sleep and activity patterns, circadian rhythms. All of these facets are underpinned by different brain circuits. And that by measuring them in patients, we can start to understand which patients are more alike versus others. Some may have a problem cognitively, their thinking is slow, they're not able to make decisions. Other of them may have problems with drive, so they're feeling anhedonic or low motivation, not able to really take pleasure in activities. And those are different brain circuits, but even though they are different brain circuits that we understand in the subjective experience that a symptom, for example, would take the form of, when you actually measure those brain circuits directly, they don't often correlate with symptoms. One of the things that we find in research as well as in clinical care is when somebody tells you something about one of their symptoms and you think what you're getting at is a circuit in the brain, in reality, all of it correlates with the level of distress that they're experiencing. If you actually measure those functions, so you measure cognition, you measure motivation, gives you a totally different perspective. And in doing so, we can really start to see groups of patients who look much more like each other biologically or very different from each other biologically, but all the while have the same symptoms. And even though that they have the same symptoms, by looking biologically either distinct or similar, they'll have different trajectories of response to existing treatments, antidepressants, psychotherapy, and brain stimulation. And so it tells you that there's a need to measure brain circuitry in various ways, and that there's a need to do it in a scalable, clinically tractable way, because exactly as you said, we need to impact the real world clinical care that's happening out there where it's all trial and error, and we don't have the tools that people, deserve to be able to treat what they're challenged with, what they're suffering with. And so we use tools like EEG, which stands for electroencephalography. It's a way to measure brain activity by putting electrodes, much like you have EKG electrodes for your heart. These are for the brain. You put them on the scalp. We measure behavior that the people might basically do from just throughout their daily activities. So attending to something, memorizing something, making judgments about rewards or different emotions. And then things like their sleep and activity patterns, which we can do with a wearable device. All of these things are measures that I think it's really important to appreciate, map onto those brain circuits, but importantly add onto the subjective experience of the patient and our understanding of their diagnosis based on their symptoms. So this is not trying to replace diagnosis. This is trying to inform us in terms of what we can measure in the person that directs their treatment.
So there are no blood tests for depression. There are no blood tests for Alzheimer's disease. There's really no blood tests for Parkinson's. So they all have something in common. So I just want to read some statistics. Depression is a common illness worldwide with an estimated 3.8% of the population affected, including 5% among adults and 5.7% among adults older than 60 years. Approximately 280 million people in the world have depression. So recently, the FDA approved an Alzheimer's drug for the first time in a long time against the advice of the advisory committee, which is very rare. And you know, it's controversial, but everyone is saying, well, we've got to approve something. But you know, when I see, you know, what you wrote is that there's been no drug in many years, and people are not as outraged about this. But the pharmaceutical companies are kind of given up looking for drugs, and but also, I mean, you know, one of the things about depression and anxiety disorders is that they can also be treated by seeing a therapist. There's biofeedback you can do. There's people do, you know, you can say electrical stimulation. But for someone severely depressed, electrical stimulation is not going to work. Maybe transcranial magnetic stimulation might work. But someone severely depressed, they need, you know, someone suffering major depression needs a medication.
That's right.
It's hard. You know, there aren't a lot of psychiatrists around, as many as you know you'd like. A lot don't accept insurance, so it's up to the internist, and they'll prescribe probably Zoloft or Prozac or Celexa, and when that doesn't work, they have to refer a person to, you know, to see what can you add on to it.
Right.
And so it is a problem, and depression is growing. I mean, you know, especially because of the last 2 years, but just in general, people, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty, which, you know, is a cause of anxiety, and there's also been a lot of bad. I mean, people have been very depressed since the invasion of the Ukraine. So,
that's right. Lots of stress. I mean, that's the thing, right? We're living in times which I think to everyday people illustrates the importance of mental health. You know, we should always have known this as a society, I think, but the pandemic has really put a spotlight on this. It's one of the things that, in a way, obviously, while negative for a lot of people, in a more hopeful, future-looking way, I'm actually hoping that this is one of the things that helps really bring some urgency in solving this, because as you said, you know, nothing has changed in the field. The numbers of patients, the amount of stress, the amount of, and we're just talking about depression, right? But for all other mental illnesses as well, numbers have been increasing, suicides, overdoses, you know, plus things like schizophrenia, which has never gone away and doesn't have a lot of wonderful treatments behind it, autism, where we have very few treatments at all, right? These problems are only getting bigger. And so we need to demand a different approach. And it's interesting, you know, as you were highlighting the Alzheimer's Aduhelm approval, which has been, as you said, controversial. It's controversial for a really specific reason, which is there they didn't have the ultimate clinical outcome that everybody wanted to see, which is improvement in cognition, functioning, and so forth for patients. What they saw was biology changing, which is actually great, but you need that extra really important part where you show that people's lives actually change. And so for us, and for me personally, that is a really important factor that we always have to keep in our mind, what it is that we're trying to improve, and symptoms, functioning, practical outcomes for people has to be the North Star of that. But at the same time, we need to be able to do our assessments of patients differently. All clinicians know this and they want it, but it hasn't really been there for various reasons, part of which is sort of the world translating from research in a lab to what a company could do and a product that a company could then sell. And a big part of it is, as you highlighted, the pharma companies, which had been, I mean, they revolutionized depression through the introduction of SSRIs, which made primary care doctors, internists, OBGYNs able to prescribe antidepressants readily and increase access for people as a whole, but then they stop there. And the reason they stop there is, to be honest, the reason that I left Stanford to start Alto, which is that they've not had the tools, the kind of tools that we think we now have to measure biological attributes about people that guide understanding of disease, that guides development of treatment. And it's not a radical departure from the rest of medicine. That's what oncology now does routinely. It's just never touched psychiatry. And so what I like to do is a sort of thought experiment, right? That let's think 5 years, because I think it's actually only in 5 years, but let's even say worst case scenario, 10 years into the future. If you had a test that you could take, and you could take in the comfort of your own home, tells you about some functioning of your brain, that directs what kind of treatment you should get, that you're going to have a much larger chance of responding to because there's really a match between biology and treatment, that changes everything with respect to expectations of patients, expectations of family members and clinicians. The moment we have that switch happen to any link of biology of the patient to treatment effect of the drug, I think it's a change in imagination that happens for everybody in the field. And we start to demand that this is the outcome. We demand that mental illnesses are taken care of in the same ways we take care of I hate to use the term physical illnesses because it is all physical, but non-mental illnesses. That the kinds of outcomes, the time it takes for somebody to know whether they've gotten better and to be able to be put on the right drug faster, that's really demanded as a basic part of what good medical care is in the 21st century. And we're not there yet, but I think we are well on the road. I would hope within 5 years, we'll start to get there.
So in the 1960s and 70s, 50s, 60s, people were ashamed to talk about having cancer. And it took someone like Betty Ford to go public and some other prominent women. The mental illness is always, my dad told me that, my dad worked for NASA, and he said that people, like if an astronaut was mentally, had a problem, he would see someone and just pay cash. He would not go through, even if it cost a lot of money, he did not want to go into the health insurance. There's a stigma. Look what happened to Eagleton, the vice president, who revealed that he was hospitalized and had depression. And so people saying, great, look what he's accomplished since then. It's like he had to go off the ticket. And do you think the stigma is going away from mental illnesses as it's now kind of being seen as a physical, a brain disorder, or do you think it's really still there? People still say to depressed people, I don't understand why you're depressed. You got a great life. You got a great job. You got a wife that loves you. You got kids that love you. You got a husband that loves you. Whatever. And people still say that, or do people just say, just try and cheer up, and they don't say that to a person with high blood pressure or cancer,
Yep. So stigma, is a funny thing when it comes to mental illness, because part of it is stigmatizing in the sense that you're the other, right? That you're not seen as part of that group or somebody I identify with, maybe because I'm afraid of having what you have. And so, there's stigma there, but there's a weird, deeper stigma actually when it comes to mental health that may be changing, but I think that there's pivot points we'll make in the next 5 to 10 years that should change that more. And let me explain what I mean. Part of the stigma is this idea that even within ourselves, treatment is part of the other. That is, if you have diabetes, you don't think about going off your insulin because it's your insulin keeping you healthy, not you. Mm-hmm. But in depression, people talk about going off their antidepressants all the time because it's their antidepressant improving their mood, not them. Inherently, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, especially if going off of your medication actually makes your symptoms worse. And so the way we relate to mental illnesses is in part, I think that stigma is in part related to the treatment itself. That if you feel that the treatment is something for which you get a test that identifies what treatment you should get and that treatment works, it feels much more like a medical condition that we know and understand, and then people won't be clamoring to come off of their medications. They'll understand that it's a feeling that you have, dysfunction in your life, you get a test, you get treated, it's part of routine care. I think the stigma that we have seen lessen, thankfully, is due to the younger generations now being able to talk about things much more openly. And frankly, the openness that social media, with all of its problems, including those that create mental health problems, has allowed people to express themselves anonymously or non-anonymously and have people echo their struggles. So that's really positive, but there's still this underlying source of stigma that I think relates more to the diagnosis than the treatment, and perhaps even more ultimately to our sense of agency. That if mood or thinking, right, is so deeply rooted to our human sense, if that's altered externally, is it the drug or is it you? In reality, what I try to explain to my patients is it's you the whole time. We're just finding a way for you to be a more healthy, more effective you, and frankly, the kind of you that you would want at the end of treatment. It's not, there's nothing external about it. It's still your own brain, and your own brain has to heal.
Okay. For people listening, thank you for listening, as always. And if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box. We have one. Before we get to that, so 5 years from now, what can we expect from your company?
5 years from now, I hope that we'll either have a drug on the market or about to hit the market that will be at least one drug guided to individuals with a particular biological attribute, an EEG pattern, a behavioral pattern that identifies who are the right people for that drug. I would expect that drug to be then more effective than just taking any standard of care trial and error approach. And I would hope that really changes people's imagination for where we are. Part of the important thing to appreciate about what we're doing at Alto is because our view is actually that there's a lot of drugs out there that have been developed by pharma at some level of clinical trials, but have never gotten to market, where the issue is actually finding the right people for a drug that we know enters the brain and has some effects. That allows us to start with drugs that are already midstream. What that means is that though we had to do all the typical testing that you'd have to do for any drug, by starting midstream with a drug that we already know is safe, we can get something on the market faster. It's, my own sense as a psychiatrist is one of urgency, and that's magnified by being an entrepreneur and just wanting to see the solution already being implemented. I would hope in 5 years that's what we're looking at.
All right, so here's a question. Modern treatment of physical disorders is trending too slowly towards concurrently addressing the mental tolls of illness. Does your company focus on physiology only, or will the design of clinical trials and drug delivery also include simultaneous psychological support? And if so, what kind of support?
Yeah, so that's a great question for several reasons. One is, of course, just highlighting the challenges of doing clinical trials. I think clinically, of course, we would give support and psychotherapy, at least in some form, to our patients as we deliver a medication. That's, I think, a common practice that should be certainly more so among psychiatrists. But in clinical trials, we have to control the variables that we basically are evaluating. So as we look at a particular drug, because the drug should work by itself without a required psychotherapy, we're looking at the effects of that drug alone. But the expectation is in clinical trials that, for example, a drug that improves your cognition and your mood, that would be a great thing to put together with psychotherapy, even at the realm of supportive, not really structured psychotherapy. Part of the appreciation, I think, in terms of from a biological perspective, what these drugs do is what's called neuroplasticity. That is, they change the ability of the brain to learn and to adapt to stimuli in the world around us and within us. And so part of the ability of the person to recover is that the drug changes how they interact with the world around them, and then how they learn through the feedback they get from the world around them, how to better regulate their emotions, for example. And that's in part how we think of the action of our drugs, that a drug that improves cognition and mood will improve those capabilities, which you then use in the real world, which can then be further enhanced with psychotherapy. It's just that in clinical trials, we have to be a bit more narrow in what we're testing in order to really show the efficacy.
What's your take on the movement towards psychedelics in psychiatry?
So I think psychedelics is a really interesting opportunity. Of course, every one of these has to go through the FDA just like any other drug. And psychedelics, on the one hand, I think that there's a bit of a hope within them that comes out of, if you will, uncontrolled use in the past. And we're seeing what that's starting to look like in clinical trials. But on the other hand, what psychedelics all point to is exactly what I mentioned before, which is the importance of neuroplasticity. And what we'll see in the next, I don't know, few years, probably, maybe a little bit longer, is that there'll be a sussing out between, is it the psychedelic aspect of psychedelics, the sort of mind-altering aspect, or is it the plasticity part of psychedelics? And my sense is actually that plasticity part's really important. And that's part of what some of our drugs, for example, target, is enhancing plasticity per se without that psychedelic experience. But that for certain people, the experience of being able to leave your normal pattern of behavior and pattern of thoughts, even absent anything else, is helpful. Just sort of a reset, if you will, or pushing you in some direction that is uncomfortable for you and you would not explore were you not in that situation of a therapeutic relationship. But psychedelics, I think, will teach us a lot. I think there's going to be, and there are actually already, companies developing drugs that work like psychedelics on plasticity, but don't have, they think, at least based on animal work, that psychedelic property. That will be really instructive. And my guess is at the end of the day, the psychedelic process, the psychedelic drug development process, as well as just recreational use that people are doing more and more and structuring more and more, will teach us about more than just psychedelics, about how to alter the brain, how long a short-term treatment can last. There's a huge number of things that we've yet to learn, and perhaps we're not even expecting that will be one of the main learnings that we'll get out of it. We're just at the beginning, really, really, really beginning of that effort.
So what is your review of the earlier efforts reported on by Charles de Baptista in 2010, utilizing predictive EEG with outcomes database defined as REEG? And how does your current efforts differ? So that's a very technical question.
Yeah. So let me abstract that a bit. I think some of those efforts, and Chuck actually is a professor at Stanford who I know well. Okay. Those are really early efforts. There's certainly been use of EEG in the past to try to guide choice of current antidepressants. I think that work certainly needs to improve and get to the level of machine learning rigor that we see now. It's sort of pre-modern machine learning. But the important part for us is actually developing new drugs based on these sorts of signals. So to be clear, one of the things that we're not doing is guiding care with existing treatments, which people are getting access to already. Your primary care doc is usually primary care and OBGYN are the people who mostly prescribe that first antidepressant. But it's what you do when you go beyond that. And you need at that point new medications that work in different ways. That's where we're focused. Introducing medications that work in entirely different ways from what's out there, guided by knowing the biology of the patient, but also not just in depression, in PTSD, in addiction, in bipolar disorder, all areas where we have deep, deep need clinically that frankly, any new treatment would help. PTSD, we've not had a treatment approved in 20 years. Bipolar depression has very little. Addiction, most of what we're actually doing just for an opiate, giving them another opiate, is not really a treatment of the core addiction. So huge progress to be made across the board. And we see all of that as our playing field at Alto.
So are you just looking at depression and PTSD, or we include other diagnoses?
Yeah, currently the trials are just in depression and PTSD, but in short order, there will be other diagnoses. From a company sense, of course, you have to be focused and you have to see success. From a personal and a professional sense, I want to be able to expand as quickly as possible, just because the need is there, our tools are there, it's just a matter of getting the work done.
So here's a question. Do you believe there's a role for retinal imaging to help in the diagnostic workup, potential responsive treatment? I know that there's been some talk about retinal treatment for Alzheimer's disease, but I don't know anything about depression or PTSD.
Yes, so that hasn't really been studied. The retina, just for kind of information's sake, the back of your eye that perceives light, right? That's actually the only part of the brain, of the central nervous system, that is, that you can directly visualize. Everything else is, if you will, behind your skull. And so there's entirely a possibility that, especially out of machine learning on images, which is such a powerful application of machine learning, we could learn something. For example, you can look at retinal scans and determine gender of patient, which one would not think would be an obvious thing you would get out of a retinal scan. But in depression, it hasn't really been looked at very much. I think what that highlights, if you sort of generalize the question, is that there's going to be things that we're not even looking at now that may not even occur to us, that may have signals relevant to understanding the biology of the person. How they interact with their smartphone is something that people are starting to look at, but hasn't been as deeply dived into. But certainly, there's a lot of things that one can measure that would be relevant. And I think that's a huge and unexplored, exciting area of how do we make sense of a person and their biology in the least invasive way, but yet direct care based on that in a scalable manner.
So what kind of policy changes would you like to see implemented to help the horrifying number of people with undiagnosed mental problems and broken coping mechanisms?
Yeah, so boy, I would put a lot of budget towards that. If I were in government, there's a couple things that are already happening now. So the president does have a mental health initiative that's going to fund things like the 988 line, which is like 911, but for mental health crises. So we know that now as the suicide crisis or prevention hotlines. They're a bit of a patchwork all over the country, and at present not particularly well funded, and there's areas which are not particularly well covered. That's going to be a really important addition. And then trying to increase workforce and access, especially to things like telehealth. But that's like a very near-term goal. For me, I would look at this as much more of a moonshot. I think that we've been doing, and we've done now a couple times, cancer moonshots, and various iterations of that under different names. We have to fund at the level of the need, at the level of the disability created, the level of the crisis. If you look across the board, whether you're talking about research from an NIH perspective, or how you deploy services, or things like training, we spend far less right now from a US government perspective on mental health than any other part of medicine when you control for the prevalence of these conditions, how common they are. So across the board, we need that funding. And I think the initiative that the president is now trying to get through Congress is great, but it's the first part of that. I don't want us to take that as sort of the final word and that we've satisfied all the need.
So here's a question. Will the drug you create be fast acting?
I hope so. That's certainly one of our goals, is not only get patients better, but get patients better faster. Not every drug works as quickly as you want, just because the biology takes some time to change. But some of our drugs certainly will, and they're designed for that. But still, even within 4 weeks or 6 weeks, if I could get you better more effectively, and I can put you on that drug the first time instead of the fourth or fifth or sixth time, that all helps. And if I can make that lasting, that's going to be fantastic. So all of those factors we're pushing on. But the key at the end of the day is understanding who we're treating and going beyond our historic diagnoses, which were never developed with biology in mind, to actual simple biology we could do in the home and we can scale on. And really through that change people's imagination of what treatment looks like in psychiatry.
Do you see any utility of smaller, accessible, ultra flow field MRI scanners within the psychiatrist's office in the future?
So not in the immediate future. Things like MRIs are and various other types of imaging that are, they take more expensive machines. They'll take footprints that are more significant. That'll always be a challenge. But I think that the question perhaps kind of makes reference to the fact that also these diagnostics are themselves an arc over time. So we think routinely, right, that a CAT scan or an MRI is just part of our medical care. It didn't used to be. It was initially thought that various ultrasound-based tests, like for the heart, might have extraordinarily limited use when they were initially released, and people were uncertain of really what the value of that technology is. It turns out it's central to evaluating the heart now, because people have learned how to use these technologies. And as you start using it for one thing and you realize there's other uses, that starts to spread the tools. And we'll see that for the brain as well. Because remember, right now we're at zero. A typical psychiatrist or anybody evaluating a psychiatric patient will literally not have at their fingertips any test to run. All that's typically run is a set of lab tests to make sure there aren't other causes for their depression, like thyroid levels, but we are literally at zero. So as we still start to build momentum, as we change people's imagination, I think we'll start to see a number of new tools develop. Things become more routine in medicine. It's going to feel very, very different.
Have you been working with, or do you plan to work with the Veterans Administration to assist veterans who have PTSD?
100%. So the 10 years that I spent at Stanford, I was jointly appointed at Stanford and at the Palo Alto VA. So we've been doing that for a long time and been doing research within the VAs, and in our clinical trials, we have a number of VA sites. So we consider the VA to be a very close partner here, and absolutely a focus on veteran well-being writ large is a major area of focus for us.
All right, so I want to ask, so Aaron Beck passed away, I think the last year.
That's right.
Great man. I mean, he invented cognitive behavioral therapy, which, some of the greatest psychiatrists say is very effective. It's not a drug treatment. It's changing the way people think. And so, I mean, there are other, I mean, they say that the best, they always say the best treatment is a combination of medicine and psychotherapy, because for mental illness.
That's right.
Yeah. So do you think that's true for any illness? I mean, a person who gets diagnosed with cancer probably wants to talk to somebody.
Yeah, actually, one of my colleagues at Stanford, David Spiegel, has actually shown that psychotherapy for cancer can prolong life in basically how people manage their stress, manage their emotions. Psychotherapy has broad application across the board. I think what we saw with CBT, with this sort of development and deployment of CBT, is people started to think differently about what psychotherapy looks like. Excuse me. So in the past, prior to that, psychotherapy was really more of a psychodynamic or psychoanalytical focus, and CBT basically made it a little bit more structured and focused, and allowed it to be manualized in the sense that more people could learn how to do it, and they could do it with less training. So that changed people's imagination of what psychotherapy can be. A good treatment, and this is acknowledging that not everybody has access, perhaps even a minority of people have access to really good treatment, which involves medication and psychotherapy. That psychotherapy access part is really a big issue. But good treatment should involve medication and psychotherapy, at least some type of supportive therapy. And that's how we would imagine our drugs would be used when they get out in clinical practice. There is utility in thinking about psychotherapy as itself a learning process. So a drug that enhances the brain's plasticity should enhance the ability for people to benefit from psychotherapy. But at the same time, psychotherapy is hard. It's not for everybody. As we have known for years, the modal number of visits in people in therapy is 1. So you go once and that's it. So obviously those people are not deriving much benefit. It's hard. Psychotherapy, to do it well as a patient, requires being open and vulnerable and being ready at that time to accept change. Often that's where a drug comes in, and that it helps you start to feel better and better engage with the world, so that you could do psychotherapy more effectively. So all of these are sort of clinical nuance and clinical treatment in the real world. Everything, there is no absolutes, right? I think certainly worldwide, we hopefully have come to understand that everything has to be brought into context. The drugs we're developing are in the context of a more wholesome treatment, a fulsome treatment. And psychotherapy, even just supportive therapy, knowing that somebody's there and cares about you and is trying to help your outcome, could go a really long way.
So is your initial focus going to be on refractory patients and depression and PTSD? And why don't you first explain what refractory patients are?
Yeah, so there's different ways to characterize depression based on the degree of resistance or refractoriness, which is to say people who've gotten treatment and not responded. And so there's different definitions. The details aren't particularly important, but you can ask, for example, did the person fail to respond to a drug or a number of drugs? Are there particular kinds of drugs that the person has tried? Did they try multiple different categories of drugs? All of that you can quantify as the level of resistance of the patient. They could have tried psychotherapy and it not work. They could have tried transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is a non-invasive brain stimulation, or ECT and not work. So that's all sort of their different levels along the clinical continuum. Our studies for depression are actually, for the most part, for people who failed even just one medication and are looking for that thing that's not that next SSRI and trying another medication with trial and error. But we also have some trials in people who are not on any antidepressant. For PTSD, generally those patients have gotten a lot of different treatments. But when we treat them, we look at people who are either on or not on medications, because there is just so little effective out there for PTSD. While we have, well over a dozen easily accessible antidepressants on the market, right now there's really only 2 drugs on the market for PTSD, and they don't work terribly well, which means as a psychiatrist, you're not only using trial and error between drugs that are not even FDA approved for PTSD and may not have been studied for PTSD, and yet we still need to help our patients. So we're hoping that our drugs become first-line treatments for PTSD, given the paucity of what's out there.
So, during the pandemic in New York City, homeless people were moved to the Upper West Side and put in, hotels. And there are lots of problems, and what people realize that a lot of people who are homeless are mentally ill, which is something right. I've known for a long time. And I know some very wealthy people who have, loved ones who have just disappeared on the streets. And how do we reach those people? Because these people aren't going to therapists.
That's right.
Probably not getting, we're not being screened for depression. And society doesn't look at them kindly. And what is the hope for the most, vulnerable people?
Yeah. So what we've been talking about so far is treatment in the context of medical care, right? Of
Right.
seeing a psychiatrist, primary care. But there's also the societal aspect that we didn't touch on, which is the resources for people who are the most disabled by their illnesses. So people who are homeless, but not just people who are homeless. There's a wide swath of folks, for example, with addiction or with schizophrenia who can't support themselves, who are kind of at a marginal level of existence in terms of being able to get food, be able to get housing. And part of the problem has been over the past number of decades that we've closed the kinds of facilities that in the past used to house them and provide care for them. So state and hospitals, for example, have closed. I mean, they've only gone in one direction, which is more and more close over time, which leaves us without the resources that these folks would need. Day programs, residential programs, inpatient hospitalization that could be long-term. The average hospitalization on a psychiatry unit now is like 5 days, and that's not enough to resolve almost anything, and certainly not a chronically disabling condition. And so that's a societal part, back to the question of policy, right? That is a societal solution that will involve better treatment with medication, psychotherapy, and so forth for those folks. But first of all, get them a roof, get them meals, get them a role in society. One of the most fascinating things is actually the position in society and the relationship to addiction. You can even take a monkey and change its position in the dominance hierarchy, and it will become more addictable or less addictable. More addictable if it goes down the hierarchy, and less addictable if it goes up the hierarchy. Very basic stuff like that translates to people and how we consider and employ and value people at different points within our society. So those are not purely medical interventions, or they're larger scale and policy interventions. And that's kind of what I mean too, with respect to how much we have to put into this to solve mental illnesses to the degree that we're able to solve non-mental illnesses.
So are you going to use transcranial magnetic stimulation in conjunction with medication as part of your treatment plan to help enhance neuroplasticity? So first, why don't you explain TMS?
Yep. So TMS involves a powerful electromagnet that you put next to the head. The electromagnet is basically, think of it as running a current in this very large coil that creates a magnetic field. That magnetic field goes into your brain and excites wires in your brain, that is neurons. Neurons connect to each other via wires essentially, and that's what we can activate non-invasively using a magnet that's pulsing outside of your head. The strength of that magnet at its peak is roughly the strength of an MRI machine, but the difference between an MRI machine and a TMS machine is MRI machine doesn't pulse and the TMS machine does, and that's a world of difference in terms of being able to drive brain activity. What you can do with that clinically is you can increase or decrease activity in different brain regions. And for the past 20 plus years, it's been studied as a treatment mostly for depression, but there are other approvals more recently for things like obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. It is an effective treatment for depression, including very refractory patients. But just like every other treatment that we have, it works well and differently from sham TMS for a minority of people. Now, what the question is, and there are no biomarkers, there's no biological test to identify those people as yet. What the question is asking is, well, if you're stimulating the brain and creating plasticity by stimulating the brain with particular patterns, and you have a drug that does something related to enhance plasticity, wouldn't it be interesting if the two went together? And I completely agree. In my lab at Stanford, we've been studying TMS and its effects on the brain for years. And I think actually that idea is very, very attractive. From a practical perspective, it's really just impractical to start there, but actually very much hoping that exactly what the questioner asked is what we end up doing in part is just like leveraging psychotherapy, which is a form of plasticity, with a drug that enhances plasticity, leveraging non-invasive brain stimulation as a form of plasticity with a drug that enhances plasticity. And some of that will happen in our trials, some of that will happen in clinical practice when the drug is out there.
But this has to be done under medical supervision.
That's right. So it has to be done in a clinic to make sure that some of the very rare risks of brain stimulation, which is seizures, don't happen. The risk of that is exceedingly small, but that's just not something you could do at home because there's still that risk.
So do you see that the modern, the traditional model of, a person going to a therapist, talking to them, getting a medication or not getting a medication, do you think that's going to change? I was talking to one doctor about, they have a nasal form of ketamine that's been approved, but you have to have the patient wait around to make sure his blood pressure is okay. And psychiatrists don't work like that. Psychologists don't work like that. They can't have a patient just sitting around, and treating someone and then checking in 15 minutes and checking in 30 minutes. That's not how they work.
That's right.
So is that model going to be changing, or you think it'll be certainly telehealth has changed, the way we do therapy.
That's right. In psychiatry, as of all of medicine, psychiatry, I think, has been most changed by telehealth because, we can deliver so much more of the care just by the interpersonal interaction by remote. What I'm hoping actually happens is because medical practice is so hard to change that we don't require psychiatrists, primary care docs, and so forth to learn how to do an EEG or how to administer a behavioral test, that all of that stuff is done in patients' homes entirely by remote. So the patient is then engaged in their treatment. They get a test result, they take it to their doctor who prescribes the drug in basically in the same flow of medical practice that they're already used to, except now informed by a test. And that allows us to really change how people are treated without having to also change workflows, which in medicine is a very hard thing to change. And also having the benefit of engaging the patient proactively in their own treatment course. And that to me is actually really exciting, is you now bring all the stakeholders in and you deliver them a better outcome as a consequence.
Okay, I'm going to do a final question, then I'll let you go. Does the pandemic, as a cause of relatively widespread depression and anxiety, present a natural experiment to analyze how people with different brain profiles respond to the same outside influence?
Yeah, I think that we're just seeing the beginning of that. I'm a bit surprised we've not seen more studies come out. There's so many aspects of the pandemic, whether you're talking about the effect of the virus, the effect of the virus secondarily, like the fear and the change in behavior and the isolation, the sensitivity that people might have to how they perceive that if they have depression, for example, and consequently the effect on depression. Long COVID is an open question in terms of what exactly that is and how do you treat it. Do we think COVID is something different from just any virus that has, in some people, a long-term consequence? It may not be, but it's certainly way more prevalent than other viruses. So it's a clinically relevant and important question. Tons of things that we're only yet to answer, in part because we're just at the point of making sure that we're, safe as a society, as a nation, just from the basic exposure and risk with a virus. I think the effects of COVID in many ways, both good and bad, if you look at like telehealth, for example, being a good outcome, will be with us for some time, and we'll be working through how to make sense of it for some time.
All right. Is there any, do you want to do a little closing statement?
I think we've gone over a lot, and I guess my view at the end of it is that, I'm excited for where we're going. I'm bullish about the timeline to getting there, personally, I can't wait till we can finally bring a change in how we treat psychiatric conditions, how we treat neurological disorders, finally bringing measurement into practice here and driving new treatments. But more than anything, what I hope is what we end up changing is people's imagination of what could be. Because there's so much more that could be if we just rethink the approach that we're taking to mental illness today.
Okay, well, thank you. Before you go, next Wednesday, March 23rd, I was talking about a new book that came out, Medical Marijuana and CBD Oil. And I think it's two people who wrote the book. It's a great book, and we look forward to that. So I hope you'll join us for that. My guest tonight has been Dr. Amit Etkin, and he's in California, so he still has some daytime left. But anyways, and also thank you for people showing up on St. Patrick's Day, because I know there's lots of other distractions. So thank you so much for spending time with Science Writers in New York. I want to thank my co-chair, Joe Bonner, who's behind the scenes and who put this on YouTube for people who are out partying tonight and having a good time. So thank you so much. And I think you were great, very informative, and we hope you succeed because it's going to help us all.
It's my pleasure. Look forward to continuing the discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you. Everyone, good night and stay safe. Take care.